sexy on Secular Sexuality.
Hello, and welcome to Secular Sexuality. I am Bianca, and with me, as always, is Christy Powell.
Howdy.
And today we are welcoming Kella Hanna-Wayne, who is a disabled activist and writer, the main writer behind the social justice blog Yup at yopvoice.com. She writes educational content meant to equip people to understand all forms of social justice, and also talks a lot about her experiences as a disabled and chronically ill person. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about the intersection of chronic illness and disability and sex, and kind of how all those things intertwine. Kella, welcome so much.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get into activism? How did you find that that's something you wanted to do?
I kind of fell naturally into activism. I feel like I've kind of always had those tendencies, even like as a little kid. I was just very concerned with what was right and what was just and not hurting people. And so I just kind of fell into it as that came up in my life, as it became relevant. Feminism was one of the first ways that I was exposed to that. And then just gradually finding out about more and more issues, I incorporated more and more of them into my activism. Disability activism came into my life when I became disabled in 2014. And that was a whole new branch that I knew nothing about. And so I just try to incorporate as many different types of activism and as many causes as I can.
Awesome. Wonderful. I've written for Yup, and I've read some of the articles there. It's a great blog, great website, so you should definitely check that out. And we'll have all that information in the description down below at the end of the video. If you are watching and you have a question about disability and chronic illness and sex, feel free to call in. We do have lines open, and we are taking calls. The number is 512-686-0279. And we'll be taking calls throughout the broadcast. So I think we'll just jump right in and ask a couple basic questions kind of about chronic illness and disability first, and then move into the sexy parts a little bit after that.
Sure, and as we do, I guess I just kind of wanted to highlight something you said, Kella, which is this idea that feminism was sort of a gateway into this sort of activism. And I don't want to overstress it, but I think it's really interesting and really important to remember that learning how to treat people, as women are and as feminism intends to do, is expansive. That idea, once it germinates, begins to include different races, different orientations, different cultures, people of all different sorts. And I think the opposite is also true. And we're seeing that a lot in our country when we allow a little bit of aggression towards trans folks that begins to erode the rights of queer folks in general, which is, misogyny and homophobia are very closely tied to one another and all of these things. So I just think that that's such an important thing to, I guess, highlight.
Yeah, one of the primary lessons from my writing, my educational material on Yup, is the idea that there are a set of principles in activism that if you follow, you can basically apply them to any type of social justice. That things like our tendency to center the privileged groups, our tendency to scrutinize the action of marginalized people, the way that language comes into things, the lack of awareness of people's problems, all of those things are applicable to basically any social justice cause. And understanding the concept thoroughly helps you apply it to other causes that you are less familiar with.
You hear that, TERFs? Take notes.
Right? Oh my gosh. No, I totally agree. In fact, I remember talking with one of my friends, and they were talking about how it seemed to be a pattern that people discovered that they were not cis, either trans or non-binary, after interacting with feminist groups and in feminist circles, because that's where that kind of comes into play, where that kind of acceptance and discussion kind of happens. So the feminist movement and the trans movement are kind of interlinked in that way. which is fascinating. We can go on about that all night. But kind of coming back to what you were saying about language and how we use language, I think the very first question that I want to get out of the way so that we're making sure that, we're using the right words for things. Are there specific terms that we should be using as a general populace for people who are chronically ill and or disabled? Are there good words? Are there not so good words? Is it an individual basis kind of thing?
Well, everything is always going to have some amount of individual basis that, as with anything, what your personal preferences rules over other things. But on the whole, most people in the disabled community prefer disabled person over person with disabilities. That by and large, they prefer identity first language over person first language. Other words, so obviously there's the extremely more offensive ones that are clearly offensive, like cripple, that you don't want to say. But then there's also some of the more PC words that the disability community doesn't like ultra-abled or special needs or, just differently abled, things like that, that are generally not liked either. Some less known ones, well, handicapped is kind of going out of style. It's kind of outdated at this point. I'm not a bathroom stall or a parking spot.
Right.
And another one a lot of people don't know about is wheelchair bound is not a good phrase to use because people that use wheelchairs, they are not bound to their wheelchairs. Their wheelchairs are the reason that they can move at all. And they are their source of freedom, not their source of constraint. So that's a common one. But in terms of what words you should use, wheelchair user in that case, otherwise just disabled and chronically ill, like it's pretty straightforward that you can use those terms and they are pretty widely applicable.
Okay, good to know. That's very interesting about the wheelchair bound versus wheelchair user, because I also know that a lot of people who use wheelchairs aren't necessarily bound to them 24/7. And
Exactly.
if people see them get up, they're like, what is this? It's like, no, like they are valid tools that these people are using, but it might not be a 24/7 kind of thing. And that's a misconception that I think we need to work on. Okay.
Some other language that comes up a lot in relation to that. Special faker is one that a lot of disabled people hear, and also real disability or really disabled. Those are ones that come up. And then the last one that a term you need to be careful with is calling disabled people inspirational. For me personally, it's just like with being a woman and being considered sexy. It's fine if someone thinks that I'm sexy as long as they think that I'm other things too. As long as they see that that's part of me being a human, part of my other types of competence and skills. But so often disabled people are reduced to just being inspirational and being inspirational for like just existing and just doing normal things. So that's a term that you have to be careful with.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Kind of magic minority thinking that, the so-called good bigotry, right?
Oh, gosh. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Good to know. That's very helpful, I think. And honestly, we could talk about that all night, too. We're going to be jumping around quite a bit and only touching the surface for a lot of these things.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if at any point you're like, stop, we want to talk about that, just let me know. So I guess I've got a question. Kind of seeing both of these terms used often together, sometimes interchangeably. Is there a distinction between disabled versus chronically ill? If you have a chronic illness, are you can you call yourself disabled? Or are there disabilities that wouldn't be considered chronic illnesses?
I think that there is a very large overlap between the two, but that they are two distinct things. I was thinking about this leading up to the show and trying to figure out what the distinction is, because I think there is one, but it's hard to define. I'm sure some of it is identity, some of it is just what you resonate with. But the way that I would describe the difference between disability and chronic illness is that a disability has to do with the structure of the way your body and your mind are made, the way that they are structured and how that interacts with the outside world. That the outside world is not set up for the structure of your body and mind to function easily. Whereas a chronic illness, there's actually a sickness involved. It's about how your body responds to like external stimuli. And so whereas accommodation for a disability usually has to do with the setup you have around you, the physical things you have access to, the tools you have, a chronic illness being accommodated is usually a lot more about medical treatment. And like environment and and medication or diet or that kind of thing.
Interesting. That's a really interesting distinction.
Yeah, no, it makes sense because, for instance, somebody who has perhaps had a foot amputated or something along those lines may be in every way healthy. They're not struggling with a chronic illness. However, they might need different accommodations or just not fit into a world that isn't accommodating to those kinds of concerns.
Interesting.
While we're talking about language, I'm certainly not looking to gatekeep, but I'm wondering if there is a distinction or a particular definition of the word disabled that has like a bar attached to it. I mean, if you, for instance, suffer from depression, that is a chronic illness and it can be completely disabling. Is there a magic number, for instance, or just some point at which you become disabled?
I think that disability is a very personal thing in terms of whether you call yourself that. I would say that like objectively, the difference is at what point does it interfere with multiple aspects of your life? And the interesting part of that means that if you are fully accommodated, you become less disabled. And so in theory, the social model of disability is that if you fully accommodate a disability, the disability goes away. That is not the case for all disabilities, but in theory, that's possible for some people.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah,
all right.
Absolutely.
That was a really good question. Are there any other kind of simple misconceptions, things that people ask you a lot that we can kind of debunk here super quick before we jump into the major portion of the debunking, which is all around sex? Anything that you've come across in your activism as you've interacted with other people who are maybe also disabled and struggling with things that you'd like to just clear the air about?
So my biggest thing with having people that are not familiar with disability to help them understand is that I think that a lot of the able-bodied world, which is the opposite of disabled, looks at disability and frames it in terms of a lack of something, in terms of something not working, and in terms of something being broken. And the majority of disabled people don't think of themselves that way. So many disabled people, disability is part of their identity, it's part of who they are, and able people will be like, why would you define yourself by something you can't do? That sounds so depressing. But that's not actually what's happening. That when you identify as disabled, when that's part of who you are talking about the creativity and the adaptation and the innovation and the reinventing things that is required in order to move through the world with a disability, that those are special qualities and skills that you have to have. And that sets you apart from other people, and that enables you to connect with other disabled people in a special way. So if you can look at disability through that lens of people that are adaptive, that are creative, that look at things in a different way that way, rather than in you can't do something, I think that just immediately helps shift everything and helps people connect to disabled people a lot better. The other big thing that I would want to debunk is that there's a really, really strong cultural attitude that it is the responsibility of abled people to assess whether or not someone is disabled, and whether or not resources they are using, whatever they are being used appropriately. And first of all, you cannot tell by looking at someone whether or not they are disabled. Just 100%, you cannot tell. And if their disability is visible, like if they're using a wheelchair, even then, you cannot tell to what degree it affects them. You can't tell what their disability is, how it's going to manifest. And you don't have to. There's no reason for you, a stranger, looking at someone who's disabled to be like, what is their disability? What does this mean about them? What should they be using? It's not your business. Like, it has nothing to do with you. And this is just a really, really common thing that people will be like, are you sure you're supposed to be using that? And it's just not your responsibility.
Right. That's a really good point. Any other questions you've got?
No, not along those lines. I definitely hear what you're saying in terms of people who have disabilities, people who really have any kind of different experience, don't need outside validation from us. I mean, as human beings, we all crave validation. We all crave to be seen. But unless somebody is asking you for that, there's no need to step in and talk to a stranger about whether or not their identity conforms with how you think it should be.
Right. Just general rule of thumb. That's probably a good thing to keep in mind. I was fascinated by the way you phrased it. You said in a world where certain disabilities were accommodated sufficiently, those disabilities would then cease to exist, which is fascinating and not talked about at all.
Well, and it only makes sense because, my eyesight in particular is not especially bad, but if it was a little bit worse at another point in history, I would potentially be considered disabled because I wouldn't be able to function or see well.
Oh, same here. I can't see shit like this far away.
Yeah.
Like without maximum contact lens strength. Like,
sure. And as technology advances, we have found very simple ways to accommodate my, personally minor restriction. And so it's not something I think of. I certainly myself don't think of as having a disability, but at another cultural moment, at another place and time, that might not be the case. And so as we develop as a society and as we, not only expand technologies, but expand access to those technologies, and it's not even just about modern technologies, of course, it's about, ramps and doors and everything else, but by creating a world in which people who have different capacities are empowered, their disability stops becoming noticeable in that same way.
What are some areas, kind of like what you were talking about, just we've made accommodations for certain kinds of differences in how we're physically built. And so we don't think about it as being a disability anymore, which kind of proves your point. What are some other things that we can be doing to just move us closer to that goal of eliminating certain things that don't need to be hard for people, but just we don't think about it as able-bodied people? That's not on our minds.
That is such a huge topic. I'm going to try to give you the biggest overarching things that I can.
Sure.
I think the first thing to do is to understand that there's a massive amount, there's just so many places where there isn't accommodation, where people think that they are offering access, where they think that the services they are offering or the building that they're making are accessible, and they are not, because they haven't consulted disabled people or people that actually specialize in this to figure out whether or not it's actually accessible, that they have these ideas. I honestly don't know where they get their ideas from, but they just decide this is what accessible looks like, and they're like, that's good. And so something I hear from my disabled friends on Twitter a lot is they say, I called the restaurant and I asked them whether they were wheelchair accessible. They said, yes, I got there. They had 2 steps at the front door.
Gosh.
Like, that's not...
Right,
You're right, that's not...
Yeah,
So,
there's a restaurant that my grandfather and I like, and he's not in a wheelchair. He uses a walker. And so even though there are ramps, and theoretically somebody who was in a wheelchair and was very mobile wouldn't have any trouble, but because he's in a walker, it means that I can't push him up that ramp. There's no other opportunity. And this very new building is set up such that it literally took about 20 minutes for him to get from the car into the restaurant. And that is an exhausting task for him, and something that is going to spoil his dinner in a lot of ways. I mean, just knowing, he wanted to go through it and we sat down and we ate. But then there's that thought of, okay, well, now we got to reverse this whole process. And just going out to dinner is a bit of a struggle for him physically. And so adding that on is certainly not accessible. And yet I'm, willing to imagine that this rather new building is meeting all of the official formal legislation around being accommodating.
Mm-hmm. And quite honestly, I would almost hazard to say that the majority of buildings in existence are not fully ADA compliable. And that's a common thing, that you just find buildings that just straight up aren't following the laws. And it's like, you've had 27, 28 years now to do this, and for some reason you're not. So I think one of the big things that I would say, what can we do, is start enforcing the ADA.
So there is more enforcement then. Mm-hmm. That's honestly news to me. I've always kind of felt like, oh, well, maybe this building got grandfathered in, or maybe there was some exception. I've always just sort of assumed that there was some kind of loophole that was being exploited when I see those obvious, 2 steps as you walk in the door type of issues. But to find out that likely those are in violation of the law is shocking and upsetting for me, honestly.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yep. Yeah. There definitely are exceptions. There definitely are loopholes in terms of older buildings, which, you can have a debate about the value of the building versus the value of the people that use it, blah, blah, blah.
Sure.
But even just within what the laws are and what the loopholes are, there is a huge amount of not following those laws. I think another big thing is lowering the threshold, lowering the level of difficulty for seeking accommodation in the workplace or in school. Both in terms of the social attitude around it, about not making it a taboo thing to be ashamed of, but also really emphasizing that that's something available, really working in good faith with, whoever it is, whether you're employing them or you're teaching them or you're managing them, to find solutions for them, to find things that work for them. A lot of that is attitude changes that have to happen so that structural changes can happen. That the structural changes are pretty difficult to use without the attitude. But that's really a big thing, that in order for jobs to be easier for disabled people to get, in order for school to be easier for them to go to at all, and then bouncing off of that, universal basic income. Because there are a lot of disabled people that cannot work no matter what accommodation you give them. It's just not a possibility, or they cannot work enough to earn a living. And so things like universal basic income, or other types of coverage so that you can, afford to live without having to work. Those are really big, important things for giving disabled people a good life and a good existence.
Yeah.
No question.
For sure.
Okay, well, before we move into the next round of the interview, would you like to go ahead and jump on the phones?
Yeah, let's jump on some calls.
Okay, absolutely. Well, we've got Jen in Tennessee.
Hi, Jen.
Jen, what can we do for you tonight?
Hey, V.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you guys tonight?
Doing good. What can we help you with?
Well, it's just a topic that was kind of relevant, and it's not apparent,
miss it. I mean, this is
quote unquote what they would call a typical disability, but reproductive disabilities and sex life, and throwing a wrench into that. I had adenomyosis, which is I don't know if you guys are familiar with it. It's not a very common reproductive issue. It's the sister issue to endometriosis, and it made sex ridiculously painful. It enlarges your uterus. It pushes the cervix down to the point that a lot of women who do have this not only can't have sex, but can't have children. And instead of there being research on it and being a comprehensive cure outside of having a hysterectomy, there's really no funding for it. Also, I learned when I was previously married that I was not allowed to have a hysterectomy to cure the condition because my ex-husband wouldn't sign off on it, and we didn't have children.
That is just a remarkable thought.
That is disturbing.
It's amazing.
Wow.
I didn't have children, and my ex-husband wanted children. And when I had my son, I had asked for one during the C-section, and my ex-husband said no.
Wow.
So I would still need to keep a very painful and enlarged uterus that couldn't let me function for 2 weeks out of a month. But it's kind of overlooked and it's more pitied on.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And it's, oh, you poor thing.
Mm-hmm.
When are you going to start having children? Well, I have a reproductive condition. Oh, but there's adoption.
Right.
You can do in vitro. What about a surrogate? And it kills the sex life in a marriage. I mean, you don't want to be touched for 2 weeks out of a month. So this is kind of something that you don't want to be touched. And when you are touched, it's like, ow, ow, ow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, how are you going to have kids if you can't get to the point of having them?
Well, and just the underlying concept that is where your value lies. That if you don't have the ability to have children, then you're somehow no longer important as a person. And
right, exactly. That's the problem. The problem is the children you're not having, not that you're in pain.
Right, and this notion that by removing your uterus that, somehow you've given up, that you've given up on life, you've given up on your purpose. I mean, I think that is in many ways an underlying concept in all parts of our culture.
Mm-hmm.
And it causes physical ailments. You look pregnant all the time. I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You look pregnant all the time. It doesn't matter the weight you lose. These surgeries that require diagnosis separate your abdominal wall, so your abdominal wall never goes back to what it was. Trust me, no matter what you do.
Mm-hmm.
And and this kind of falls for both biological male and biological female people. You're right, your worth is tied into you having kids. So when you turn around and say, I have a condition, it's either met with, oh, I'm so sorry.
Mm-hmm.
That must be devastating for you. No, I'm shocked I had a kid. That was never a driving force for me. I'm shocked I even had one. Or it's met with, we know an adoption broker. What about IVF? I have friends that have done this. And then you suddenly become the topic of these conversations from other people talking to their friends. And I'm like, wait, whoa, when did you start paying rent in my uterus? Talking about it.
Right,
And
exactly. You become a project.
Yeah, for as uncomfortable as we are as a society in talking about sex, we are remarkably comfortable talking about a woman's fertility. Not talking to a woman about her fertility, but making it like a community action problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember when I went to have my diagnostic surgery to see what's wrong, my mother-in-law and my sister-in-law looked at me and I said, I'm going to find out if I can function for 2 weeks out of a month and what's going on and how we can get a grip on it. Both of them looked at me and went, and babies? Oh, yay, I'm an incubator. Joy for me, I have another purpose.
Yep.
But it's kind of something that we don't touch on for both biological male and biological female people is reproductive disabilities and reproductive issues do kind of cause a sense of dysphoria for your self-worth because you're constantly being told your worth is how many kids you can pump out for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden you're a failure at that.
Yeah.
And you get well, why haven't you had kids yet? Are you going to have kids? And it's like, maybe I don't want to talk about this. Like, why?
Gotta keep the quiver full.
Gosh.
Oh, no, let's not even. Let's
Everybody just winced.
And I do wish it was something that was more talked about, especially in women's reproductive, biological women's reproductive systems. Men have Viagra. We have things that you can get at CVS. But I know from my condition, we don't know anything about it. The only cure is either a hysterectomy or a shot that surges your hormones for 6 months and then completely shuts them down repeatedly.
Yeah.
They say, take birth control. That shit don't work. Birth control don't work with this. It's, take a pamperin and, friggin' get over it.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of going back to what we were talking about in terms of kind of making some societal changes in how we view disability and how we accommodate it. Same with chronic illness, especially ones that affect primarily women. It's there's not the funding, there's not the research. Those things don't get talked about as much.
They're not respected. I mean, I was recently reading a piece about how up until, I think, a week ago in Germany, which has a very high sales tax in the way that their economy is structured, they were taxing tampons and pads and basically all menstrual products as a luxury good.
Yep.
Because as opposed to, the way they tax aspirin or Band-Aids or, those basic necessities of life.
Right, exactly. And that was just last week they nixed that. Oh my gosh, yeah.
Which is, I mean, it's exciting to talk about progress, but it's also just worth noting how little attention the people in power, and by the people in power, I mean hundreds of years of men, have paid attention to these types of issues.
And yeah, it's one of the causes of mine is C-section. So this is something that you're expected to have a child. And when you have which we can get into a whole argument about the C-section mom thing, but now you're kind of locked with this condition. And then what are they going to do for you about it? It's not important enough. What they tell you to do is have another C-section.
Yep.
You can only have another C-section now because of the scarring. You won't be able to have children or have a much lower chance of having children if that's what you want. This isn't even addressing the absence. I mean, my cramps were comparable to labor in the transition phase. It was so bad. I got pain meds thrown at me, and it took me 5 years for a doctor to take me seriously.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they did research, and they were like, well, the period cramps are about the same, like, can be up there with heart attack in terms of pain threshold. And yet we're told, just suck it up, it's fine. And that's that's without additional complications to that whole process.
All right, and I've seen women with my condition, that had my condition, I've since had a hysterectomy, that have shown up to the ER hemorrhaging, bleeding, and, she just has her period, she has a quote-unquote heavy flow. And it's like, no, this woman is hemorrhaging. Why are we not taking her seriously?
Yeah.
I've seen teenage girls that have that endometriosis pass out in class from blood loss, and they're not even sent home. And it's mind-boggling to me. It's considered an autoimmune disease. This is chronic. And unless you are over the age of 35 and have 2 kids and get the permission of your husband, you can't find a cure for this.
Yeah.
You can't. You're not allowed to. I had to wait until I was divorced and single 4 years before they were like, we have nobody to ask. Okay, yeah, you can go.
Oh my gosh.
You can have the rights over your own illness and your own body. And it blows my mind at this point.
Oh, yeah. The fact that this is still an argument that we have to have and a discussion that we need to talk about is exhausting and highlights how far we still need to go. Oh, my goodness.
It seems like this is a really perfect example. It seems like this is a really perfect example of the way that the intersection between disability and being a woman or being female presented, that as you were talking about, that illnesses that are associated with biological females, that they're not as well researched, and then of course they're not taken seriously by doctors in emergency rooms and so forth. And as a disabled person, any kind of disability, you're going to be coming up against the difference in what your body can do and what society expects you to do. So you already have that just on a purely physical level of, how do you work if you're not able to function 2 weeks out of the month? How do you get accommodations for that? But then adding being a woman on there too, then you're also dealing with the attitudes of, you're also not catering to the expectation of having children. You're also not catering to the expectation of like being easily available for sex and penetrative sex being the only type of sex that exists, and all that kind of thing. That you just have so many more avenues that you are not meeting the societal expectations and having to just go in the face of that and try to get your needs met anyways.
Oh yeah, 100%. Go on, Jen.
It's sad that reproductive issues are not seen as a disability. I know men and women that have had numerous surgeries, can't be at work without being on pain medication, can't drive. and they're offered nothing. It's oh, okay, well, your arms work, your legs work. It's just, here, take this pill. You'll be fine. You'll be fine. You'll be fine. Get back to work.
Yeah.
Why aren't you up taking care of the kids? Why is your house a mess? What do you mean you can't do this? How come you can't come into work? And when you look at the list of qualifying disabilities, none of them are covered.
Yeah.
None of them are covered.
Oh gosh,
for
that's
any
a whole
care,
that's a whole other topic right
Yeah,
there.
I mean, a guy gets hit with a football in the balls and it's game over. Like we've got to call an ambulance, we've got to shut down the workplace, like everybody's got to go home. It's over. Sorry. I'm glad that we're talking about it. I'm glad that we're raising awareness. I'm glad that we are, working to push the needle and to change these things. But yeah, Jen, when you first called and talked about having to go through a divorce in order to get a procedure to make life palatable, it feels like something that if you told me happened in the 50s, I would be curious about. To recognize that it's happening, in many ways now and still, is very frustrating.
Yes.
Truly.
But on the flip side, it's you don't qualify for any form of disability. This is not seen as a disability, but it's considered a pre-existing condition and falls under the guidelines of being not coverable. A lot of insurance providers will also offer a maternity rider that you have to pay extra for because this is considered a reproductive issue. And should you get pregnant, may cause complications within the pregnancy. There's also 2 options for endometriosis and adenomyosis: hysterectomy or get pregnant. Those are the only ways your symptoms are going to alleviate themselves.
Oh my gosh.
Pop out more kids, don't have any more.
Oh my
Because
gosh.
there's no funding. There's no funding. There's no research for this. They still don't know what causes adenomyosis. They don't know.
Right, exactly. Which is why we need to get more women into STEM so that we actually have people who care about this thing.
Well, and in government to enforce, insurance companies actually covering these important things, to enforce policies that, allow women to exist as people.
Right? Oh my gosh. Revolutionary
Not
thoughts
as
here.
incubators.
Oh my gosh. Jen, thank you so much.
We're an incubator. No problem, honey. It was good talking to you guys.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. Good talking to you.
Thank you.
You too. Bye.
Bye. It's nice to hear from Jen.
Yeah, no question. And I just remain baffled.
Yeah. It's crazy. I remember in 2017 I was suddenly hit by something that I did not understand. I went looking for answers. I spent so much money and so much time in doctors' offices, just like specialist after specialist. What is wrong? Like, do all of the scans, all of the exams, and they said it was IC, which is interstitial cystitis, which is just kind of a word for something's wrong. We don't really know what. We don't know how to fix it. For a while, it was debilitating. I couldn't go out. I couldn't do anything. Sex was off the table for months. It also affects, what is it, like 98% women, or people with urethras that
Uteruses?
No, not uterus, because it's not reproductive.
Most
everyone
everybody has a
urethra.
urethra. Yeah,
that's true. And I couldn't help but think, like, if these percentages were reversed, if only 2% women had this condition and it was 98% men, like would there be just throw your hands up in the air, like, we don't know, deal with it, I guess, like maybe it'll go away. It's a real issue.
And that super long time of trying to find an answer, of seeking doctors and people not taking you seriously, and just like, what is going on? That is so central to the experience of being a chronically ill person. It's definitely true of disability too, but particularly for chronic illness. So the disability that I have, which also includes a bunch of chronic illnesses, is called Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome, and it's a connective tissue disorder. It affects basically all of the systems in my body. But the way that it's a disability is it causes chronic pain and injury. But the average amount of time between first symptoms and diagnosis for Ehlers-Danlos syndrome is 10 years.
Goodness.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well,
So I got lucky that I haven't had a formal diagnosis, but I got my answers about what was going on at 6 years after my initial symptoms and just 1 year after my symptoms got severe.
Oof.
Well, and we mentioned, more women going into STEM, more women going into politics, these different things. Are there other options, solutions? I mean, obviously, we should be, voting with a conscience, voting with an awareness of these types of concerns. But what are maybe some of the answers specifically for these, I don't want to say reproductive, but particularly issues along these lines?
I think that there are two major ones. One is healthcare. Just making doctors more affordable to see, making tests more affordable so that you can even have the option of going through that whole process of trying to find what's wrong, because many people don't.
Sure.
So that's a big part. I think the other part is, I don't know all of the specifics, but I know from a friend of mine who's worked in the medical industry that there are just a lot of structural issues in terms of how much time nurses or doctors get with patients, what boxes they have to check and which forms they have to fill out, and that things are framed in a very like black and white way, and it makes it difficult for them to look at things in a more blurry sort of way, because bodies are not black and white. They have all sorts of weird things that happen. So some of those structural changes, and I had a friend who summarized it as we need better doctors. That as much respect as I have for the doctors that exist, and particularly nurses and how hard they work, there is a really big problem of doctors not taking patients seriously, of not listening to what the symptoms are. I recently heard from a friend of mine that has EDS who they were seeing a new doctor, and they were looking at her x-rays from a few years ago, and they were saying, did you get a car accident in this frame of time? And she said, no. Why? And they said, well, we have these hip fractures that we knew about that were from blah 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 blah, but there's these other two hip fractures from that time that like the report says were recent to that time. What caused those? And she was like, I didn't know that I had those hip fractures. The doctor didn't tell me, because she just had chronic pain everywhere, so she didn't know. And the doctors knew, like it was in the report, it was in the x-ray that there were these fractures. The report detailed what the fractures were, and that information was never given to her, and it was never used in terms of her treatment.
Oh my God.
And that's a thing that happens all the time, that people will have their results. It will actually say in the results what is going on, or this thing is unusual, or look, that x-ray is wrong. And they just won't do anything with the information, which I really don't understand why that's happening, other than like problems with like ego or something. But so whatever it is that we need to do to make that stop happening would be great.
Yeah, I remember as a kid, hearing on commercials, ask your doctor if such and such is right for you, and being kind of confounded by that, thinking like, why should people go to the doctor and ask for a medication? Isn't that the doctor's job to be able to know and tell? And just the older I get, perhaps the more jaded I get, the more I realize how important it is for folks to be able to advocate for themselves, to become an expert on their own bodies and their own conditions, which is really not something that we should be, if I can use the word should, asking people to do. We should be able to let certain portions of the population specialize in learning everything about the body and rely on that, but it's certainly not the reality of the world that we live in.
Right, and it's interesting because I know that there are people who have brought up the connection between kind of realizing the gap in medical knowledge and medical concern for certain groups of people, and the rise of things like the anti-vax movement and naturopathy, and like depending on outside information and outside sources, because you are feeling like there are things I'm not being told. There are things that they're either keeping from me or they don't care to explain. So I'm going to go find my own way. And more often than not, it's harmful or at least ineffective.
Yeah, it's ignorant homeopathy, or it's, WebMD and everything is cancer.
Well, yes.
So our tools and our options are really limited, sadly.
Yeah. We have another caller.
Absolutely.
Who
Would
is
like
going
to jump on the line with Rory?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Rory, hello.
Howdy, howdy.
Hello. How are you tonight?
I'm good. I am glad I was able to make it to talk to you guys tonight. I'd left a long old message on your hotline thinking that I was not going to be settled for the night in time to talk to you, but as luck would have it, I made it in time to call in and actually have a chat in person. So
Amazing.
That's a good thing.
Yes, for sure. We're
There
happy
you
to
go.
have you on. What can we talk about today with you?
I am a blind person. I have been since birth, completely blind, no vision at all. And I am ex-Christian. Started losing my faith, I guess, maybe 8 or 9 years ago. And as everything takes a while, finally decided I was done with it about 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
All that being said, growing up in small town South Dakota, actually grew up on a cattle ranch, very fundamentalist. Sex of any kind even dating was about marriage,
Right.
Sure. Yeah.
And so, add to that, having a disability, there's no way you're getting away with anything in small town South Dakota because you have to take the bus home from school every day, a half hour. And if you don't, you have to have someone give you a ride. So there's there's no way to clandestinely do anything. If you know.
Sure.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So anyway, jumping forward then, all through my 20s, I was still very much Christian, pursuing Christian music ministry, all that kind of stuff. So only when I disabused myself of all these silly notions I had as a fundamentalist Christian did I finally actually start to have any kind of sexual experiences, whatever, which developmentally delayed me in that area significantly,
Sure.
as you can imagine.
Yeah.
Okay, so, I did not even know what the female anatomy was until I was in my 30s. I mean, a blind person can't look at porn, right? And as long as, you have to have someone who's willing, you have to, be in a relationship with somebody or whatever. So that's how that happened. But it didn't happen until, pretty late into my, into my 30s, as I mentioned.
Yeah.
Anyway, I guess getting to more of my question, or what I think might be interesting to discuss, is how might a blind person kind of be more proactive? I guess, to put it, any of the relationships that I have been in have basically kind of been serendipitous. One girl I was in a relationship with, I was in a band with her, and another one we met at a guitar convention, et cetera, et cetera. And so anyway, a lot of the just casual hookup apps, Tinder, or et cetera, are completely inaccessible to blind people. I mean, you just can't use them. And plus, they're so picture-oriented anyway.
Sure.
Right.
That is really not, so I don't really even know what my casual alternative is. For something more long-term, there's the dating websites and stuff, and I'm just kind of, I guess I don't know how particular I should be in my profile. Like, should I be ex-Christian blind guy seeks, I kind of feel like I'm excluding a lot of people, but still there's things like she's got to be, disability friendly. She's got to be atheist friendly. She's, I don't want kids. I'm very adamant about that, and kind of so how just how much of that do I just kind of throw out there? And I just don't know. I mean, it's like, I don't know how I can be more proactive, I guess, is what my question is.
Right. That's a really good question. And thank you so much for calling in, because that's by itself just a fascinating story. And congratulations for getting out of Christianity. So that's a rough journey by itself. So
well, it's even more difficult. 3 out of the 4 of my siblings, well, we're all blind, all 4 of us, but 3 of us have become atheists, one of whom went to Bible college and married a pastor. And
wow.
That has brought about several family problems, as you might expect. And, my dad doesn't want to, do Christmas with us this year, and, all that. I mean, that's a completely different topic, but,
Sure.
That's the life. That's what happens.
Yep. I feel you there.
Yeah, in terms of how to, I guess, roll these things out, which is kind of what I heard in your question is, when you're introducing yourself to somebody, when you're meeting somebody maybe through a dating website or something like that, at what point do you sort of blurt out these aspects of yourself? And I think that's a good question that we all kind of struggle with in different ways, no matter what the thing is that we're looking to share.
Mm-hmm.
I would point out that...
it's like, does she find out I'm blind with the minute we meet up face to face? I walk in with a white cane, and then she's like, "Oh crap! I wasn't expecting that."
Yeah. Sure, and I think that's a valid question, and I hear all kinds of answers. And so what I would maybe even suggest to you is that I don't think you owe anybody a warning, if you will. I don't think you owe it to anybody to disabuse them of their assumptions before you meet them or even after you've met them. That being said, most people, when I talk to them about coming out as polyamorous, maybe to somebody on a first date or something along those lines, find it's useful to save everybody some time by letting them know at the gate, oftentimes in their direct profile or even just in communication after that initial match. Mm-hmm. As far as accessible, dating apps and things along those lines, it's my understanding that OkCupid in particular is incredibly accessible. They do have a phone app, but they function primarily as a dating website, I guess, if we're drawing a line between those two things. And so it works with an e-reader, and as I understand it, has been pretty well structured to be accommodating in that way. Beyond that, I mean, Kella, do you have any particular advice?
So the question of when to disclose is definitely a big thing for disabled people that are dating. If you are online dating and so they can't see that you are disabled, there's a question of when do you disclose in terms of in proximity to when you meet them. If your disability is invisible, then you do have to, as you say, come out as disabled. Otherwise, they won't know. So when to do that, I think, is a really personal question. And what you might need to do is experiment with disclosing at different points in the process and seeing what happens and seeing how you feel about it. Mm-hmm. Because some people prefer to disclose ahead of time because they don't want the in-person rejection. They don't want to have the experience of someone coming up to me and being like, "What? I didn't know you were going to be like this. This is weird." Mm-hmm. So some people want to avoid that. I know that one thing that people will do is they will not disclose until a little bit before the date, and they'll basically call a few hours ahead of time or something and say "Hey, just so you know, I'm going to be in a wheelchair when you see me, or when you see me, I'm going to be using a cane. Just a heads up that that's what's going to happen." And then that gives them an opportunity to cancel then. Rather than getting stood up or whatever. And so then you have a little bit of lead time, so they have a little bit of time to prep for it, but it's not all the way at the beginning. Other people want people to know that right away. If that is something like, I don't want to waste my time with you if you're not cool with this, or if disability is really important to you and you don't want to hide that, or that's a big part of your life in general, what you're going to be talking about and what you're involved in, then that might be earlier in the process. So I think my main advice is think about if you have any preferences, if you have any fears or worries about what might happen in a given part of the process, and try disclosing at different times in the process, see what happens, and see what your reaction is to it. And go off of your reaction, go off of what feels most comfortable to you and what feels like would be a sustainable thing for you to do, because you don't want to be breaking your heart over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. And, again, my, the two, like, I guess, somewhat significant relationships I've been in were, people that I just, through serendipity met. One was, like I mentioned, in a band I played with, and one we met at a guitar convention that I was at. And so that, I've never really tried the, like, dating web. Well, the ones I tried, like I mentioned, were pretty inaccessible. I will have to look into the OkCupid thing and find out about that. So that's good.
Yeah, and I'd love to, I guess, just take a moment to shout that out to our audience as well. If anybody is aware of a dating website or anything along those lines that is particularly accommodating or accessible, please let us know in the comments or in the chat.
Cool. Yeah. And I guess as far as the rest of it, I'll just have to make up my own mind. It's like, I know I need somebody who's not religious,
Mm-hmm.
because I'm just over that, obviously. So non-religious, disability friendly, don't want kids. It's like I'm just eliminating like 90% of the population before I even begin here. So,
well, which is fair though, because you don't want to date 90% of the population.
Yeah, none of us do.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so, like Kella said, it's good to experiment and try and find what kind of feels right or fits for you. And I would just encourage you to do so, knowing that, of course, you want to be kind, you want to be communicative and compassionate with the people who might be your partner, but you don't owe anybody an explanation at any stage. Mm-hmm. And so there's not a right or wrong way to do it. Ethically, I think that you're really in the clear. It's just about what feels comfortable and feels right for you.
Very good. Well, I think this was a productive conversation. I enjoyed having it with all of y'all. So.
Oh, thank you so much for calling in.
Appreciate you calling in. Take care.
Best of luck.
All right, take care.
Yeah, the notion of exploring the female body as a cis male who hasn't experienced sight at an advanced age. I mean, that to me is just a fascinating story, and I'd love to hear more details at some point.
Yeah, Rory, call back. Let's talk more for sure. But these conversations that we've been having kind of answered a lot of the questions that we were going to be talking about anyway.
Glad to hear it.
So it's segued super nice. So can chronically ill or disabled people also be sexually active and sexy and want that and pursue that and get that? I think the answer to that clearly is yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no question.
Yeah, I feel like that's something people don't grasp. They don't see those two things as being compatible a lot of the time.
Yeah. Culturally, we really infantilize disabled people a lot.
Yeah.
So there's very much an attitude that disabled people can't have sex, that they're physically not able to, or we see disabled people as like pure and childlike, and so we see them as like not capable of consent to disability or to sex. That being disabled means that having any kind of sexual activity with them is exploiting them. There was actually a thing that happened recently. There were a group of people with Down syndrome that put on a drag show, and this was this wonderful expression of their sexuality. It was something that they were owning, that they put together. It was called Drag Syndrome, was called the show. And whoever in charge, some old white guy, canceled the show because he didn't think that these adults with Down syndrome could actually consent to doing drag. And he thought that the show was exploiting them. And he actually said that it was as if he was protecting children, that it was essentially the same thing as if you would be protecting children, what you would do for them. So like there's really, really a lot of cultural discomfort around the idea of disabled people expressing sexuality of any kind. But it absolutely is a thing that disabled people do have sex. They do enjoy sex. They can have sex. Sometimes that sex looks different. Sometimes the physicality of it is going to be mechanically different, or the setup for it is going to be different. But it is, it's just as prevalent for disabled people as it is for able people. And, and there are also people that don't want it, just as there are with able people too.
Exactly.
And there's so much hand-wringing around talking about sex in general,
Right.
that the education and the information that's getting to folks with particularly neurological disabilities is there's so many barriers in the way. I briefly worked in a home with IDD adults, and we would be constantly having conversations about, how to wash your hands, how to take a shower, how to clean up after dinner. I mean, these basic tasks of daily living. But when we would be in positions to talk about sexuality, to talk about, for instance, what is appropriate to pull up on the computer at the library and things like that, just watching the staff sort of cringe and shut down and be unable to have those conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very difficult to navigate that kind of thing if you have zero exposure to that, if you have, if you have unexplored ableism, that, discomfort around disabled people in general, and then adding sex into the mix, it can be really uncomfortable. It can be really unfamiliar to talk about it.
Oh yeah. And on the other end of that spectrum is like fetishism, right? Because if you deviate at all from what is considered the norm, there are going to be people who absolutely don't see you as a sexual being at all. And then there are people who will fetishize you. And this is something that happens in multiple communities. And it kind of reminds me, like back in the English Victorian era, women would paint their faces white because ill-looking women were considered to be more attractive, which is just one kind of example of that. But yeah, there's a difference between being sexually accepted as who you are and being someone's kink in a way that is not consensual or, again, kind of infantilizing in a way.
This is a topic that is less my area of expertise, but I know there's a group of people that they're called devotees, and they fetishize disabled people. And it's so complicated because, like, fetishization, being turned on by something that comes from taboo, that our turn-ons come from things that are taboo, come from things that we're not supposed to want. And so it makes perfect sense why that would happen. But it feels pretty gross when you're on the receiving end if you're hearing about that. A big part, I'm sure this isn't the case for all of them, but a big part of the turn-on for devotees is the helplessness of the disabled person, and the like, oh, you are relying on me completely for everything. You can't do anything, like you can't stop me, like all that kind of thing is part of the fetish. And like, if you look at that within the context of like BDSM or something, like you can definitely do that consensually. That's definitely possible.
Right.
But just from a surface level, if you're a disabled person and just like getting a little bit of that, it's like, whoa, that sounds gross. That sounds gross to me. And so that's a really delicate thing to navigate. And I'm sure for people that, that encounter partners that do fetishize disability, I'm sure it's really a complicated thing to work through, just as with any other type of marginalization that's fetishized. It's always a difficult thing to navigate.
Yeah.
And it really just comes down to putting the person first, if you are attracted to somebody specifically because they are an amputee, because they have dwarfism, because they experience these other things that look different and are appealing to you, I would argue that there's nothing wrong with that desire, even that fetishism and that specific interest. But when, in the same way, when I'm attracted to a woman, it's her personhood, that really draws me in, and that is first and foremost. And even in a one-night stand situation where it's purely sexually motivated, where there's not a lot of interest in necessarily the particulars of who somebody is, you're still acting and responding to somebody as if they're a human being, as opposed to just a woman, whatever that term means for you in that moment when you start to objectify people.
I think that one of the reasons that it's so tricky when you objectify marginalized people is that they're already dealing with a big cultural layer of being dehumanized. And so if it's the default for someone to have been taught to not consider this person as a human, and also not know that that's how they think of them, that, you know, that we don't necessarily go around thinking of disabled people as not people, you know, we don't say that to ourselves, but we do, and that is how we think about them in this sort of two-dimensional way, that when you already have that bias, when you already have that tendency to look at someone as not a full human, it's a lot harder to do something like fetishization without leaning into that bias. That you have to work a lot harder in order to combat that, and to make sure that, like, you're really seeing this as a person when you don't have that experience, of culture teaching you how to do that.
Exactly. And that kind of leads into my next question, which is, again, with any group of people who are outside of the society accepted norm, representation is everything, and how we talk about these people in any context, in movies and TV shows and music and books and literature, even right now as we're having this conversation, it helps to have people who are whole three-dimensional people and not two-dimensional, props or side plots or, whatever. And I was wondering, are there any either individuals or books or movies or anything that you've come across that really kind of resonate with you as this is good representation, this is furthering a more personhood approach to this?
Honestly, I think my favorite disabled character that I've come across in media is Toph from Avatar: The Last Airbender.
Okay.
She's a young blind girl, and she does earthbending, and the way that she does earthbending, or earthbending essentially enables her to see, but it's a different type of sight, that she uses her earthbending to connect with the ground and to tell what it is that's around her. And so she can see things that other people can't. And one of the reasons that she's my favorite is that, she never gets cured. She's not interested in being cured. Mm-hmm. She loves her ability. She loves the way that she sees. And she's totally fine with the restrictions that gives her. And she's constantly making fun of other people and the way that they interact with her disability. So, like, at some point, Sokka is drawing a picture of something that they're going to show to other people. What do you think? Is this a good likeness to this person? And he shows it to Toph, and Toph says, "Looks fine to me." So Toph is really amazing, and she's also innovative. Like, she comes up with new techniques for earthbending that haven't been invented yet. So I feel like her representation of disability I really, really enjoy. Other than her, in terms of fictional characters, I can't think of a whole lot off at the top of my head. Representation of disabled people is so low. Like, it's so incredibly rare. And most of the representation is really problematic. That it's, someone gets cured before the end of the movie, or they die before the end of the movie, or they are the only positive and inspirational person that exists in order to inspire the main character so that they find strength to do whatever. Or they're the villain. That's the other one, is that that their disability has driven them to reject the world and to take revenge for the way that the world has treated them. But that's another one. Oh, okay, that actually reminds me of another representation that's good, and that is Hiccup in How to Train Your Dragon. That at the end of the first movie, he becomes disabled, he loses his leg, and also that he has this like codependent relationship with his dragon, who is essentially also disabled, and that they work together, they enable each other to move around. And that representation in particular was really meaningful to me because, spoilers if you haven't seen the movie, I guess, the villain in the second movie is also disabled, and both of them, both the villain and Hiccup, their disability was caused by a dragon. And the villain takes that and says, like, oh, you know, because a dragon made me disabled, that is why I hate dragons. That's why I want to control all dragons. That's why I want to punish them. Whereas Hiccup is like, that has nothing to do, the fact that a dragon hurt me has nothing to do with my relationship with dragons. That, you know, that was one bad dragon and that hurt me. And even then he was just like defending himself. And that I have this positive relationship with all these other dragons. And so I really liked that because it pointed out that even if you do have a mental state of this horrible thing that happened to me caused me to do this, it points out there's still a choice. There's still something, there's still a mental, you know, a mindset going into deciding to do bad things, deciding to hurt people as a result of what you do. And that's missing so much of the time when you see disabled villains, that it's always like, oh, well, of course, that's the only thing that can happen if you're that miserable all the time is you become a villain.
That's a really good point. I didn't think about that, but you're absolutely right. That is a trope, and it's not a good one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh my gosh. We have one more set of interview questions for you, kind of some takeaways for the audience, if anybody here is listening and has some desire to take a practical tips and tricks kind of away from this. But first, I think we have a voicemail.
Yeah, absolutely. We can get that queued up with the booth.
And this is a former person who is on the show?
Yeah, so we, I guess, want to remind people about our Ask line. That's 512-666-0-ASK. After this show is over, if you have a question, if there was something we didn't get to, or if you aren't able to watch the show live, we still want to hear your questions. We still want a chance to hear from you. So you can call that number at any time, day or night. Leave a voicemail up to 3 minutes. We urge you to be concise and to give us a chance to respond and hear from you.
Yep, number is on the screen. And we're hearing from, who is this?
This is Dr. Kristen Lassiter,
Awesome.
The reproductive psychiatrist who we spoke to back in, I believe, April. That episode is still up, and I really encourage everybody to take a look. It was a good time.
Hi, this is Kristen Lassiter. So I was on the show back in April. For those of you who don't know, I'm a reproductive psychiatrist in Austin, Texas. And I see a lot of people around pregnancy and postpartum who are going through depression, anxiety, or some other issues. And one thing that I was hoping that the show could kind of talk about is how does the sexual relationship of a couple change after they have had a baby, and what are some things and some ways that they can help improve their sexual intimacy when they're also struggling with adjusting to life with a new baby, and why is that important for them as a couple? Thank you, and I look forward to hearing your answers. Bye.
Good question.
That is a whole series of questions, but I think super important ones because we do have this sort of cultural stereotype. I like to use CBS sitcoms as a punching bag, and maybe that's not fair, but then also maybe their writing is the problem. I think that it's so common that as soon as there's a baby, it's like we just take sex off the table, and then it becomes this incredible tension, and it's how long do you wait until, and he in a heteronormative couple, he's getting all frustrated and she's mad that he's mad, and it just doesn't need to be that kind of narrative. Even if penetrative sex, even if intercourse is not something that you're interested, immediately after being stitched up and having a small human being removed from your body, I can appreciate that, absolutely. But our sexuality is so much more than just intercourse. Even in a straight couple, that's not the limitation or the reality of sexuality. And so I guess the question of why is it important? Because sex is about bonding people together. It can be difficult when you're dealing with a young infant, when you're dealing with the late nights and all of these kinds of things, but it is still important to have that connection, to have that shared bond that is, pretty unique and special and not something that you put in front of other people, generally speaking. And so Yeah, I think it's about expanding our definition of sex and making sure that we are working to stay in connection and using, I guess, sex as a tool to bond people to each other rather than just like an appetite that needs to be satisfied.
Right. I think another thing is just, especially with kind of the purity culture, the Christian viewpoint to this, that, you know, pervades even outside of strictly fundamentalist groups of people, is the idea that you have sex to have a kid. So then once you have the kid, okay, well, I guess
why are you needing sex?
Why do you need sex now? So that's not a healthy way to look at that either. So yes, you've had a kid, but you don't need to wait until you're ready to have another one. You don't need to have any reason for it or any justification for, oh, well, maybe it's possible, or, well, maybe I'm not ready yet. Well, that's all fine, but you have to be willing to just be there for your partner and treat it as a pleasurable thing and as something that doesn't have all that stress on it, because you're going to have a lot of stress with a newborn. So
there was actually just recently a comic on Oh Joy Sex Toy by Erica Moen about this topic and about what you can expect in sexual activity and your body soon after having a baby. And there are a couple of them that I didn't know about. There's one that's particularly important, which is because of the way that your hormones have changed. Most likely you're going to have a big decrease in the amount of lubrication you produce. And so you have to go way hardcore with adding extra lube because you are not going to produce enough. It's just not going to happen. And then the other one that I learned that I didn't know about was that not all women, maybe not even all, the majority of people that are pregnant and have babies have the experience of an orgasm being induced from breastfeeding. That's a thing that can happen, and usually when that does happen, they're like, what did I just do?
Really confusing. You know, I actually hadn't heard that was a concern, but it absolutely makes sense to me, and is something that I think people would rather be warned about than to find out going in cold.
Yeah.
Also,
so that's our PSA for the evening.
Also, you can apparently spurt breast milk during orgasm, so that's fun.
Interesting.
You know, I felt like I had seen every damn kind of porn that there was, and then you go and tell me there's a new one.
The more you know.
Gonna have a long night?
I guess so.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, thank you so much for the voicemail. And again, anybody who wants to call in and leave your own so that we can answer it on the air for our next shows, that number again is 512-666-0ASK. That's 512-666-0275. And as we're wrapping up, because we are getting pretty close to the middle of the hour, we are going to talk a little bit about practical things that we can do if we are struggling with any kind of chronic illness or disability, and we want to engage either with ourselves or with our partners in a sexual way. So my first question is just, what are some good ways to feel sexy and desirable, even if you're struggling with something that society doesn't see as such all the time? I know for me, right after my diagnosis and being in a lot of pain, I remember being in the bathtub. I had lavender, essential oils, I had candles. I was in so much pain, but I took this really sexy photo of myself, and it was an interesting moment of like, being in pain and being sexy aren't antonyms. They're not. They can exist in the same space. And that was an interesting moment for me.
I think that one of the most important things, I think, in terms of feeling sexy and staying connected with your sexuality when you're dealing with a chronic illness or a disability is a process of self-acceptance and exploring what your relationship is with your illness or your disability, particularly if this is later onset in life, like it was for me. There's an acceptance process. There's a process of letting it be part of you, of not trying to segment off this part of yourself, but just letting it be there, and not feeling like, oh, this is actively damaging me all the time, or this is tainting me or something. So there's very much a healing process just in terms of how you think about yourself, how you, find your own internalized ableism. I think that's a really, really important part of being able to feel sexy is exploring that part of it. Beyond that, I think that looking at the exploration of your sexuality maybe from a blank slate rather than either comparing to what you used to be able to do or comparing to what everyone else does. Really looking at from a blank slate, looking at from a healing perspective of I need to transition this thing that I think of as bad or painful or sickly, and I need to move it towards something positive and valuable and meaningful, or whatever sex is to you. And have patience for that, have a lot of self-compassion in terms of the time that takes in making that transition, and being willing to kind of start over and find what works for you and what doesn't work for you, what you like and what you don't like, and just kind of throwing all preconceptions about what sex is and how you do sex and what sexy looks like for you out the window and just starting over.
And how do you best communicate this with a partner? Because that's something I think that Rory was kind of talking about on the phones earlier. That's something that I know I've had to navigate, and I have many friends who also have had to have conversations like this, either around a new partner who you're just starting to get to know, or if it is something that is on set later in life, something that maybe a long-term partner has to now also kind of start with that blank slate. How do you communicate that to a partner, and how do you keep that from turning into maybe a conversation that stymies the sexual and romantic part of your relationship instead of helping it grow?
I think in addition to you having acceptance and finding what your relationship is with your disability, your partner also has to do that. Your partner also has to go through a process of figuring out what this is and what it means for them. So there's also patience with that. I think that with the communication, one of the important things that I've heard is make sure that your partner understands that you are the authority on what your body can and cannot do. And that goes both ways. That is both, if I say I cannot do that, that's not negotiable. I can't do that.
Right.
But it also means if I say I can do this, I can. Even if it looks like I'm in pain, even if it looks like I'm having a bad day and I don't have the resources, you don't get to choose for me whether or not I can do this. I'm the one that is in the best position to make that assessment. And there's a lot of issues with partners worrying that their disabled partner is fragile and that they're scared of breaking them. And exercise caution, but also listen to what your partner is telling you about what is and isn't okay. The other big thing that I've heard is particularly important with that is that people who are new to having sex with someone that's disabled, particularly if there's something like with chronic pain happening, they always want a definitive list of tell me what it is that you can do and I will only do those things, or tell me what it is that you cannot do and I will avoid those things. Bodies don't work that way. They just don't. Bodies are very gray. They change constantly. I often say that my disability, I have a different disability every day. I wake up to find out what my disability is, where is my pain today, what movements are possible for me and which ones are not. And so even if I were able to give you a defined list of what I cannot do today, that's going to be different tomorrow. So what's the point of having that list? So really seeing it as an interactive process, as an ongoing learning process that just like with any other type of consent, that's something that's always developing. That's something that you're always seeking that connection. You're always making sure that this is still okay. And that whatever you're doing is working and is a good thing to do, that you have to continue doing that with disability as well. That it doesn't just stop because you've had that one conversation, that it continues to be a conversation over time.
bodies change, tastes adapts, and that's something that honestly is applicable across the board too. You don't get to say I had one conversation and so now everything is laid out and I can do this and we can't do that. That's something that's going to be negotiable across the board.
And I think that's incredibly true. And I usually like to point folks to Sexual Intelligence, the book by Marty Klein, where he talks a lot about how bodies do change and we need to, I guess, roll with that and accept that rather than trying to struggle and fight with that. I guess my question to you is, are there any other particular books or resources, certainly your blog, but anything else that you might encourage people who are struggling with these questions to look towards?
Yeah, one resource that I found out about, let's see, what is it called? It's called enhancetheuk.org/sexy. And this is a resource for talking about sex and disability and giving a lot of information about that. But that's a good resource. A resource that I think that everyone should have regarding sexuality, regardless of your level of ability, is the book Come As You Are by Emily Nagoski.
Mm-hmm.
That book is just so incredibly good at your own self-exploration and knowing what you need and what works for you and how to promote that kind of communication with your partner. That I think everyone on the planet should read that book. So definitely applicable here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'll just remind everybody that we'll definitely make sure to have a list of these sorts of things as well as some other resources in a link in the comments on the YouTube page.
That's great. I love getting book recommendations about this kind of thing because honestly, I'm still making up for lost time.
Sure.
After growing up the way I did, I was like, give me all of the books about everything.
Yeah.
And then I think my very last question for you tonight, apart from anything you would like to bring up as we close out, is the role of self-care in all of this, and how does that come into play, and how do you make sure you're taking care of yourself first? For me, I know that was a lot of making myself feel okay about saying no to sex and to not always being available 24/7 for it, even though I felt like as somebody with a vagina, that was my job, I was like, oh, I need to just be here all the time, ready to go. And that's not the case. And I had to make peace with that myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really important. I think maybe looking at it in terms of the goal here is for both parties to have enjoyable sex. So if you are going into this at a time when you're not up for sex, when you're going to be in a ton of pain and you don't want to tolerate that, or doing a position that is not comfortable for you right now, you're not going to have an enjoyable time, so you're not meeting your goal. And as long as you're framing it as that rather than I have to have sex a certain amount or I have to please my partner, I think that makes self-care a lot easier. Something that is kind of a double-edged sword with disability and sex is that sex, it raises your pain threshold. So you are less aware of the pain that you are in while you are having sex. This is great if sex tends to aggravate your pain, but in non-damaging ways. That basically you won't be as aware of it, and so you won't be bothered by it, which is great because pain, if you're not into that, pain can be a big libido killer. But then the other side of it is that once the sex is over, your body's wrecked. And so for my experience, basically what I have found is that I need to set aside that time, that that sex is important enough to me that it is worth it to me to do that sometimes, but I can't do that all the time. And I can't do that before I have a big long day that's planned where I'm going to be on my feet all day. If I do that, it's just not going to work. So I have to plan ahead of time. Scheduled sex is a lot more common when you have a disability. Spontaneous sex is harder to do. And be okay with that. Be okay with finding the way that it works for you. Because otherwise there's not a point. There's really not a point to making yourself have sex that you don't want to have.
Right.
Sure.
And another thing that is probably very specific to individual circumstances, but be okay getting up and leaving their house and to go home if you need to. I remember when I was dealing with this, I had been dating somebody for about a year, maybe a little bit less. And at one point, I woke up in the middle of the night. I was like, I was in so much pain. I just wanted to go home. And I did. And that was taking care of me first. And it actually ended up, my partner was like, thank you for being comfortable enough in our relationship that you felt like you could go home and you didn't have to stay and suffer at my place. So yeah, if you have that kind of communication with somebody, that's gonna fix a lot of those potential problems.
Yeah, speaking up when something is going wrong is, is always important in sex, but particularly when the safety of your body is in play. I have definitely had several times where I have not spoken up. It was totally on me. It was not something I was pressured into doing. It was just I was caught up in the moment or whatever, and really regretted it later that I really, really paid for that, and was not very functional for a while afterwards. And it was like, whoops, okay, well, I should not do that again. And you learn, you make mistakes, and then you learn from them, and that's something that you have to be prepared to do, is to have that learning curve. But it really is better to speak up and say, like, no, this isn't working for me.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much, Kella, for joining us tonight and for sharing all of the things that you've experienced yourself and that you've studied and you've researched. I think this was a very important conversation, and I'm very happy that I was able to be a part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I have been just kind of in awe, I think, of the challenges and then really the workarounds. The ingenuity, the cleverness and creativity, and just action of functioning in a world that's not really shaped or built around you. So I really applaud the work that you're doing on YOP, the way that you're just communicating to people and helping them find a way to navigate the space around them.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, you can find all of Kella's work on YOP. That's at yopvoice.com. That's your website. And then you're also on Twitter at Kella Hanna-Wayne. And you should follow her on Twitter because she has some bomb-ass tweets.
I'm also at Kella Hanna-Wayne on Facebook and Medium and Instagram.
Okay, consistent branding. We like that. Makes things easy. My gosh. Okay, before we head out for the night and before we give the sign off, we do have a call from the guest of our next show.
Oh, yeah, we wanted to make sure to let people know about the I Am Queer podcast, which will be joining us next week. And they gave us a little message to let you know what we're going to be talking about.
Hi, y'all. It's Bees and Lex. We are the hosts of the podcast I Am Queer. We are an interabled genderqueer couple sharing our perspectives on sensitive queer issues such as accessibility, ableism, and the gender binary. Through conversation, we aim to provide a space for queer individuals to share their lived experiences to help start a more intersectional dialogue and intersexual dialogue in our communities. And I was born with a brittle bone disease called osteogenesis imperfecta. It is for me, it is a genetic mutation that happened. So none of my families actually have it. You might hear us refer to it as OI for short. But over the past 3 years, Beav, since we've been dating, Beav and we've talked about quite of important topics and how these conversations, and have these conversations with our close friends. And we found that they were so important and decided to create a podcast.
Just like everyone else in 2019.
We always look forward to being on secular sexuality for any reason, but particularly we are excited to talk about I Am Queer.
Check us out on Facebook and Instagram at I Am Queer. That's OIAMQUEER, and our website www.oimqueer.com.
Can't wait to chat with you all on Thursday.
All right, well, we got that to look forward to. One half of the Oh, I Am Queer podcast has been on the show a couple of times. Lex Keaton, who's been, to my mind, one of the best episodes, if not the best episode we ever did. And so
Apart from this one, Kella.
I mean, of course, present company excluded. Sorry. So I would encourage everybody who hasn't caught it to maybe take a look and to, of course, be sure to join us next week to call the Ask Line with any additional questions about the intersection of queer and disability.
Yeah, and our Twitter is up and running because we love that cross-branding. And that is @SecularSex, and you can go there. We usually retweet all of the guests that have been on the podcast before, and we also have links to all the live shows up there, so that's kind of your one-stop shop if you're wondering what's happening or when the next show is and all that good stuff. All right.
All right. Well, with that, I guess we just really want to thank everybody who called in, everybody who joined us live watching the show, everybody who's watching it later. We're looking forward to seeing you again next week. I really want to thank you, Kella, for joining us and for sharing all of your insight, and encourage everybody to go out to, it's Yopp, YOPP, voice.com. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, absolutely. Well, check out Kella's writing. Thanks again for being here. And with that, I guess go out and give yourself a big old orgasm. Or better yet, give somebody else one.